to say, dare I say this, crucify me now, thrash metal is diet death metal. What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Metal Maniacs Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Ingersoll, and I'm here with a man that's ready to bring the noise.
Yeah, it's your boy Modd.
What's up, buddy?
I'm metal thrashing mad.
Yep.
Yep.
So today is going to be, we're going to talk thrash metal today. And I got some questions for you. So,
all right, bring it.
You know, you doing all right?
I mean, got out to the show, saw the homies in Dies this weekend.
Yeah.
Great performance.
Good.
It was nice to catch up with those dudes for a minute. Pretty much there to see those guys, and then got the new tee. So shout out for the swag guys, appreciate it. I mean, I'm good.
Good.
I mean, you know, some ups and downs. You know, sometimes you just be sitting in a mood for a few days, but I'm happy to be here, and I'm kind of coming out of a funk. But you know, it is what it is. I'm good.
Good. Yeah, I kind of had a rough week. I had bought the tickets the last week when we were podcasting, and I was ready to go. And Shauna was kind of running behind at work, and she's like, "I'm just drowning." She's like, "Can you work Saturday, please?" And I'm like, and I don't usually work Saturdays, but like, and I don't even work at the same building as her. I was like, "Yeah, I'll help you out." And then I got to thinking about it. I was tired all week because I was on this medicine dealing with this shit, and it like kind of kept me up all week. And you know how I protect my sleep at all costs.
Yeah.
So when you don't get to sleep and you're used to getting it, like you're ultra tired because you're like, fuck, man, I'm just so used to getting good sleep all the time. Well, by the end of the week, just everything wore on me, the whole computer thing. You know, I couldn't open Pro Tools. That's a whole nother episode.
It's a heartbreaker.
So I took that in or whatever, and I was just like, yeah, I'll work for you. And she's like, you're going to be real tired because you got that show. And I was like, you know what? I'm just not going to go to the show.
Right.
I love Dies. I've seen him a bunch of times. I already bought the tickets, so I was like, just gave them away. Yeah. So I gave them to the dude from Mets Fire, Mike, and he came all the way from Grand Rapids to get them.
Cool.
And I was like, so at least somebody was going in my place, and it wasn't like there wasn't two less bodies in there, because that's all I was trying to do was support them and get the bodies in that place for them.
Right.
You know, not that I didn't want to see them or hang out with them, but
no, I mean,
the shows aren't really a hangout type thing anyway.
No.
I know we said that a million times. Like maybe me and you could go to a show and hang out because in between we could go outside and talk and whatever. You know what I mean? Like we're hanging out, but when you're performing, and especially something like that, you're not really hanging out with those guys anyway. So but
I got to hang out with the wife for a little bit, and I know we talk a pretty good game about like just like not drinking or maybe her drinking, but we bought a couple of drinks, but we kind of got boned on the drinks because we had two of them. And I look over at her, I was like, "You feeling anything at all?" And she's like, "Not really." And she's like, "And I think the last one had Diet Coke in it, which sucks because I don't like that fake sugar, that aspartame stuff or whatever." So
especially if you're not used to it.
So we just went over to a different bartender and got and I expressed, "Hey, I need a Coke with regular Coke, Captain and Coke." And the last one I just gave to her. I didn't, because I'm gonna cut myself off early.
You gotta drive.
And then I wasn't even feeling after the second drink. So we just hung out, and we can laugh and mill about and talk and have a good time. But it's not like you're going there to be able to talk with the band members. I did get to shake hands and say hi and what's up and flash the peace sign and whatnot, and that's about it. Like they got things to do. I understand that.
Right.
Like I'm not trying to schmooze with the guys. Like. If they have a moment and I see Dane, I shake his hand real quick. He's having a conversation. Yeah. I'm not more important than that conversation. Right. I felt bad but we caught eyes, and it's like, well, now it's kind of weird if I walk past the dude. Yeah. I mean, if he's willing to say hi for a brief second, I gave him like the half hug and the arm shake, or the handshake, and I was like, good to see you. Have a good show, and that's the sum total of it. Like, talk to B-Man a little bit more, Ephraim too a little bit more. Just they had the freedom to have a conversation. So but when you're in the band at the show, as you know, like you feel like you got to kind of mill about and talk to everybody. So you can't stay too long in one conversation because you're like, I can talk to you for like 2 minutes, and then I have to start talking to that person and that person and that person. You start going down the list. So
it's kind of like being at a party. Yeah, where it's like you start paying attention to someone too long, even though you could continue the conversation. You're kind of like, well, I'm here to kind of mingle with everybody, so I kind of got to break up my attention span throughout. and make sure I talk to everybody and make my presence known. Yeah. So
thought they played a killer set, and they played probably one of their most technical pieces from Conquistador, Obituary.
Oh, okay.
Love that song. And I looked at Amy and I was smiling. I was like, I don't think they always play this one. It's one of the more technical ones, but it was a really good set. I had a great time.
Cool.
Missed you.
Yeah.
But I understood. Yeah. I was like, he's had a week. He's had a couple of weeks, I think.
Yeah,
so.
I try not to bail on shows, but we've also talked about that on the show where it's like, I just bought the tickets, and if I couldn't go, I'll get rid of them.
Yeah.
But I have the tickets, so my intention was to go, but some things happen, and it is what it is, and I'll play a show or catch those guys around the bend.
Yeah.
You know, I've seen them more than anybody, so it's not that I was just more support my friends, you know?
Yeah.
The other bands, I mean, yeah, we had Sissy Boys on the show. They do their own thing, and I wish the best for them, but it's not like I'm really going to run out to a Sissy Boys show just because of that style of music isn't the style that screams to me.
Right.
And I'm not really familiar with the other bands, so we'll just leave it at that. You know?
Yeah. Heard that.
Yeah. But yeah, today, so we're going to talk about thrash metal. We've talked about death metal. Go back and listen to that episode. That was one of our early episodes. We've talked about hardcore. Luke and Jeremy came over to talk to us about that, filled us in on that. Mm-hmm. Whereas I almost feel this episode is real adjacent to that one, really, once we start diving into this. We've talked about some deathcore when we went over our deathcore bands. We didn't really dive into the genre so much, but that was kind of tied in with the death metal episode.
Yeah.
So, and we've done black metal. We did a 2-part series on black metal. So we do these episodes, talk about subgenres on this show. So it's kind of fun for me, and we can just, banter back and forth. And to me, I would call this episode maybe the beginner's guide to thrash metal.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is a long time coming, this one, because it really is the jumping off point for what we have in extreme metal. Like we talked about the evolution in like one of the very first episodes, right? Like metal, the beginning. You go back to Black Sabbath, and then the evolution from there.
Yep.
And for me, this is like where I jump in. I mean, I knew metal existed before, the big 4 thrash metal bands, but it really started getting good for me once you start getting into a little bit more aggression.
Yep.
The key changes, the different key that the music is written in now, and the vocals are a little bit more aggressive instead of everybody trying to mimic Bruce Dickinson or Ozzy Osbourne, which maybe not too many copycats for the Ozzy, but a lot of Bruce Dickinsons, a lot of power metal vocalists. Mm-hmm. But then we shift out of that when we get into the thrash metal. So this is where I get excited, and I think this episode's a long time coming because this is where metal, in my opinion, starts to get more extreme.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, like I said, I'll have some questions for you because I know you're probably of the two of us the more thrash guy, especially with you just loving Megadeth so much, at least the early thrash stuff, the Anthrax. You're so versed in their catalog because you jammed that so much.
Got it all.
So I will have some questions for you.
Sweet.
To me, go ahead.
No, sweet. Yeah, sweet.
So I was going to say, dare I say this, crucify me now, thrash metal is diet death metal.
I mean,
just because I've listened to a lot of thrash to get prepared for this, at least a lot of these bands on this list that we'll talk about. And to me, it just seems like it has a lot of the death metal elements, really.
Sure.
But it's just the vocals aren't as intense. We're not speeding all the way to a grind beat. We're not all double bass all day. You know? So it's just, to me, you can see where the evolution...
Yeah,
and where the music is going.
And basically. I have to agree with you because that's in alignment with my own musical journey. Like it started with the thrash metal and the big 4 bands, but then as soon as you find like Pantera, now it's like that's even heavier than thrash metal. It's so much groove and there's just so much chugging. And then that was a quick pit stop before all of a sudden you're into Death and Carcass, and then you're like I'm done with the old stuff. Like I'm done. I've heard it all. I need this raspy, gnarly, growling, guttural, screaming banshee death metal, and it just seemed as melodic or more so and heavier. So once I crossed that bridge, there was like no going back.
Yeah.
And you can kind of tell that happened for musicians alike too. A lot of musicians were like, thrash metal's cool, I like it, and I pull from that as an influence, but there's more.
Yeah.
And so that's why thrash metal isn't as popular today. Bit of a resurgence, perhaps.
Yep.
But, I mean, back in the day, it was the cat's ass. It was everybody, it was the only thing, really. But now we're so far removed from that, and music has grown so much. So, Yeah, I mean, it is kind of death metal light, but it is also like a starting point for death metal.
Yeah. So, as far as thrash metal goes, it's an extreme subgenre of heavy metal that emerged in the 1980s, characterized by fast tempos, aggressive guitar riffs, intricate solos, and a mix of technical precision and raw intensity. The genre incorporates elements of punk rock's energy and DIY ethos with the heavy, complex instrumentation of New York wave of British heavy metal.
Yeah.
Bands like Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, and Motorhead.
Yeah.
So let me ask you something.
Sure.
When I say thrash metal, just tell me what comes to mind.
Anthrax.
Okay. Fair.
Rare. So the
like a few things.
So the riffs are almost like a 1-2 beat, duka chaka, and you're gonna be bouncing off of that E string and A string, like, and you're gonna. It's really fast, and the riffs are almost kind of shortened. You don't have long, extrapolated, progressive riffs. You just have these riffs that it's got a good groove to it. Sometimes a lot of downstroking, and everything it's kind of mid-paced, and they will break it down to a groove, but most of it is just that thrash beat. Everything's just kind of like 1-2.
Yep.
And when they groove, they might land that snare on the 3, or even you go out to like a 6/8 or something where it's every other bar you drop the snare. But yeah, I mean, I just think of the fast-paced riffage. That's the first thing that comes to mind is like fast, and just that at the gates, did a lot of thrash. Yeah, they did a lot of that riffage too, where it was just like kind of string bouncing off of the E and the A, or the or the 6 and the 5 string.
So for me, when I'm talking about thrash, and this is after I've listened to some of these bands just to get ready for this episode.
Yeah.
You good?
Yeah.
Okay. One thing about thrash is you get them drum and bass breakdowns sometimes. So the drums are kind of going and the bass is going by itself. I mean, Anthrax does that.
Yeah.
Megadeth does that. There's a lot of bands that do
that.
Yeah. Then you're talking about the gang vocal. A lot of gang vocals in thrash metal, man. Mm-hmm. Like that.
Yeah. The backups, a lot of gang backups.
Like Megadeth did it early. Anthrax did it early. A lot of these bands that we'll talk about have done that. So those are a few things that I think of as well. I think of power chords on the A, that kind of stuff. But there is a technicality to it, too, that could fit right along death metal to me, too, because some of the guitar is just shredding, man.
Yes.
And it's like, when people heard thrash metal, it's the same way as they reacted to that is the same way when they heard death metal. You're kind of like, whoa, that's a little extreme. Because if you just showed an average Joe thrash metal, they'd be like, holy shit, that's crazy. And it's like, well, you're not prepared for the next thing I'm going to show you. Yeah.
So one of the things that I think characterizes thrash metal very well is that you do have a lot of the punk hardcore like song structure or riffs in the writing. But the thing that's new when you get to thrash metal from those two genres is now you have riffs. And there's a lot of technicality with the fingers moving through like scales, where that isn't very prominent in those other two styles of music. You know, they don't get into a whole lot of riffing. I don't know if it's maybe some more blues and or jazz influence now starting to work its way into those styles to where you're making a complete departure from punk and hardcore.
Yeah.
So now you'd have a lot of very very similar riffs from punk and hardcore into thrash. But then they'll go into these very technical, palm-muted, intricate scales and such. So, and not to mention the guitar solos, like were huge in thrash metal.
Yes.
Like every song had to have 4 or 5, 6 solos in it, back and forth, and everybody get their little credits in there. Like this solo is by so and so.
Yeah, it was almost a pissing contest.
Yeah. Oh God. Right? I mean. I think we're just soloing to solo back in the day. Like the songs, all right, what about the solo section? I think that was a part of the songwriting process. Well, we got to make our way to the solo, like what's that rhythm going to be? And yeah, I think those are the things, like the technicality starts to really leap off the page when you start to get into thrash metal.
So when we talk about some roots of thrash metal, it evolved from traditional heavy metal in bands. Obviously, we talked about Black Sabbath just because of the fact that they had the down-tuned guitars, a little more darker on the lyrical front. They're the ones that really started almost everything when it came to the origins of metal. So, of course, you're going to bounce off that. Iron Maiden, complex all the way.
Oh, yeah.
They have some thrash parts, but I wouldn't necessarily say they're like, I guess you could say they're a thrash band, but they were kind of a jumping off point as well. Judas Priest, same thing.
Yep.
They're fast, dual guitar harmonies. They got a lot of shred stuff in there, but it still wasn't. And then Motorhead, they're like rock and distorted bass.
Yeah.
And a little faster than rock and roll, like a little faster than Black Sabbath. That's kind of what I see Motorhead as. Like,
all of those bands are huge influences for like the big four, obviously. That's what they were listening to.
Yep.
And they were listening to AC/DC and Kiss too, but they were younger then. Yes. And then they probably found these power metal bands that you mentioned. And then the attitude and the aggressive, behavior starts to really, take a shine to the newer thrash metal bands that are about to pop off. But yeah.
So then if you take that, and that's kind of more of the metal side, and then we come into the punk hardcore influence, like you had mentioned, right? So this is where thrash also drew from that, right?
Yes.
So you got bands like Discharge, Black Flag, and Dead Kennedys, which we spoke a little bit about in the hardcore episode, but there is a real punk metal crossover, and it kind of marries into thrash to me.
Yeah. Especially out on the East Coast, I think that style of music was a lot more popular, so that is really popular, like with Scott Ian of Anthrax. He was huge into the New York hardcore scene, and hip-hop, of course. They're, as we would come to know when we discussed things like their single with Public Enemy, Bring the Noise, you know. So they love hip-hop from the start, but also punk and hardcore, so a lot of eclectic vibes, not just your power metal. They weren't just feeding off the power metal. So when Anthrax and Metallica and these guys come about, like, I think at least on the East Coast where Anthrax is from, they were drawing from that punk hardcore scene a lot.
Yeah. So a few musical elements when we talk about thrash metal. Speed and aggression is probably the first one that comes to mind, right?
Yeah.
We got tempos, usually 150 to 250, which is pretty fast.
Yep.
You start getting into the 250s when you start talking about bands like Sodom and bands like that. And I have a whole list of bands that, like we've done with every other episode, we'll start talking about bands individually, kind of what they mean to you or me, and maybe something as far as this being the beginner's guide to thrash metal. So to help someone that, if they're interested, to kind of point you in the right direction of maybe some stuff you might like. But speed and aggression.
Yep.
We're just kind of pushing the envelope. This is where music is just starting to take what those bands that I already mentioned, and we're pushing the envelope now. Riff-centric guitar work, you said that, down picking and trem picking. Obviously, you got this driving rhythm, so that's very important. It's very driving the whole time. That's why thrash metal, when you say speed, you're talking about speeding in the car too, because you're just, So, little more complex song structures. Songs often include multiple riffs, time signature changes, and like, you could say breakdowns, but they're more of a thrash metal breakdown where you do beat it into a 4/4 or a 6/8 like you talked about. So you kind of already covered that as well. But we are getting I say more complex song structures because if you compare it to like a regular Iron Man song structure, or a early Judas Priest song structure, it's a very run-of-the-mill pop song structures.
Yeah.
Start talking about Rust in Peace.
Yeah. We
have the callbacks but then we have solo sections for 6 minutes or 3 minutes or 4 minutes or whatever. So we're or whole intros that are just this melodic musical passage, right? Shredding guitar solos, we talked about that. Obviously inspired by Van Halen. Thrash solos are fast, technical, and use sweep picking, tapping, and whammy bar effects. Also, with the thrash, there's two different types of solos too. You got the Thrash Slayer solo where it's just scribbly all over. Notes mean nothing, really.
Fast.
And then you got the complex Testament, Megadeth guitar work where you're like, these guys are Yngwie Virtuoso almost type guitarist. So there's that array. And then the more we talk about this too, in any of these genre episodes, it's a band by band basis too. One band may sound more of this style, and one band almost maybe tipping into the death metal territory.
Sure.
But we're just talking about this as a whole. So barking or shouting vocals.
Yeah.
We're not getting into the death metal Cookie Monster or Banshee Scream vocal acrobatics. We're displaying a vocal that could be a little more harsh or raw shouts, right?
Yeah.
But it usually always seems to be audible.
Yeah. So a lot of these guys weren't the greatest of singers, outside of like maybe Joey Belladonna, in my opinion. But they also weren't like Cookie Monster death metal vocalists either. A lot of it was like, as you say, yelling or shouting. They could kind of carry a tune, but it was like we're not trying to replicate Ozzy or Bruce Dickinson, as I stated.
Right.
Now we're kind of doing our own thing, and it was unique, but then again, as the style unfolds, almost all of these singers kind of sound the same. Like they're kind of Tom Araya. We're like yelling.
Yep.
And we're some screams, like the Long Angel of Death scream or something, but we're not doing a lot of the death metal style screams. So,
and then the double bass drumming. We're adding a lot more of the double bass, the thrashy like Gallop type beats. We're kind of taking that hardcore punk ethos, and we're just adding more of the metal elements, which is more of the double bass over the top. That's not real prevalent. A lot of hardcore, especially the earlier hardcore, the guys didn't even have the double bass pedals. They're just cooking on that punk beat, that thrashy kind of 1-2 beat.
I think that's one of the things that made thrash metal so much heavier than all styles before that, is because I don't think there's a lot of double bass until you get to thrash metal. Right. I mean, somebody could correct us, in the comment section. Well, hey, go back and listen to this Iron Maiden song. There's a ton of double bass, and I'm sure you're right. I'm not a very well versed Iron Maiden fan. So.
Iron Maiden too is, I don't know. Everything's so happy that it's hard to be like, yeah, that's heavy double bass. Like you could be playing double bass over that shit, and you just want to grab one of those flags and start tiptoeing through the tulips or whatever, because that's what Iron Maiden is to me.
They can play, but and that's another thing that I think shifted from the heavy metal to thrash metal is now we're writing in a different key. Everything's more minor now.
Yeah.
I mean, Black Sabbath had all the minor keys.
All the minor. Yeah.
But now, like, Black Sabbath was really slow and almost pretty chill for the most part, versus now we got the double bass and the 1-2 beat with the thrash. So, stylistically, things have changed a lot since Black Sabbath, and the minor key change in conjunction with the beats changing, like, really set themselves apart, I think, from heavy metal prior to thrash metal.
And then, we got some politically or socially conscious lyrics. Lyrics often focus on war, corruption, violence, dystopian themes, and anti-authoritarianism.
Yeah.
But that's all music. I mean, all music will you could have a band that touches on some fantasy shit and war in the same album, so you can't really say they're really politically or socially conscious. That's just kind of metal lyrics.
I think that's a band-to-band thing, for sure, but it seemed to be more prevalent in the hardcore genre, especially in that time, punk especially. Yeah. So I think that's where you get some of that. Like, if punk and hardcore is a person's influence, and they're going to say, I'm going to sing about that stuff too. That matters to me.
Yeah.
But not always the case. And I think some bands, they might have a more political era, and then they just kind of move out of it. Like, I'm kind of tired of beating the dead horse, Like, I want to sing about things that are more, like, relative to my personal life.
Yeah.
Relationships and or business deals gone bad, the industry wearing you down.
So we're going to get into the big four of thrash metal.
Yeah.
And
what is that?
These bands have really set the stage for thrash metal.
Yeah.
They influenced genres. They influenced almost every other band that came after them or next to them, really. Because a lot of these bands started at the same time, but they heard number one Metallica.
Yep.
I mean, there's bands still inspired by Metallica. And Metallica isn't thrash metal anymore. They've tried to pull a few tricks out here and there, but you cannot deny the come up of Metallica and how great those first handful of albums are.
Yeah.
I'm not a big Kill 'Em All fan, but everything in that little section there after that was just really good. I mean,
still good.
You're talking about precision, right hand precision. You're talking about solos, melody, and then they brought it into the mainstream. Really, you need something. You need a band like this to be highlighted in order for everybody else to be influenced by it. So to say they're probably the most famous thrash metal band of all time.
Yeah, I mean,
whether they're not thrash anymore, but
they're just like the most popular band of all time at this point.
Yeah, pretty much.
Bar none. Like styles aside, genre aside, like Metallica did so much for metal, thrash metal, and even hard rock music now, as it were. I think they're just the biggest band in the world. So
I'll never say anything bad about Metallica. I know they're kind of like, they had some bad albums, and Lars this, Lars that.
Yeah.
It's just like, come on, man. They're swimming in money. They've always played shows. They're still playing shows at their age.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you have? They've worked their ass off.
Yeah.
You know, they went through the death of Cliff Burton and the van. You could have quit right then because you could have shut it all down and said this was too much, but they stayed on the road. They stayed on the planes. They stayed. So I don't have anything bad to say about those guys. They got some crappy music, but when you have, what do they have, 20 albums now or something?
Not as many because they take so long between albums once you get to like the Black Album, and now it starts just taking ages for them to crank out albums. But you know what they had going, you know, like Kill 'Em All just like really kicked the door open for thrash metal. It was like, oh, nobody has heard music like this. Now, which isn't to say that didn't exist with some maybe crossover hardcore bands that were getting heavier, you know, but Metallica was the one that caught everybody's ear and eye, and I think that's where thrash metal really begins with Kill 'Em All.
Yeah.
We could go deeper into that maybe and say, you know, there's some other unheard albums. Oh, you got to hear that. No, it's Metallica.
Yeah.
Like I'm not trying to entertain too much further into the conversation. Like you could tell me there's things that were precursors to it. This is the first thrash metal album.
Cool, but did it matter?
Yeah.
No, because I don't know about it.
Yeah.
We know a lot about metal. So
I mean, some people even say Metallica wasn't a true thrash metal band, which is a little mind-boggling. I mean, I know. So some people will say like more like Overkill or Exodus are more thrash, like especially in that era. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. And I know Exodus is badass. You know, Gary Holt's in it, and I love that guy. You know, filled in for Jeff when Jeff passed away or wasn't able to play in Slayer. So we know Gary's a badass, and you know, he would sit there and tell you that Exodus would mop the floor with those guys, those other bands back in the day. And I have no reason to really doubt them, but they just didn't have the impact.
Yeah.
You know,
they're not swimming in $100 bills like Metallica is.
No.
So and that's not to say that's what music's all about. But if you want to be the most prolific band of all time and you need something to show for it.
Yeah. Well, it's one way of looking at success. I mean, that's one way is, you know, the bottom line.
Yeah.
And, you know, the way that you reach such a large bottom line is to have an impact.
Yeah.
Like people have to care and like your music and want to spend money on it.
And then we get to band number 2, big 4 of thrash metal. You can put these in any order you want. I would say Metallica's always number 1 no matter what.
I think they're in the right order.
Yeah. So you got Megadeth.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they were more technical than Metallica.
Wasn't one of their members in Metallica?
I don't know. You'd have to do some research on that. I'm not aware of
I'm
that.
not sure either. I think these guys are in competition with
you.
each
You might
other.
have to ask him. I'm sure he would tell you.
Yeah. He'll let you know. He'll bend your ear on
40 years later, he'll still let you know in articles. Yeah, so Megadeth, always loved Megadeth. Always was probably a bigger fan of Megadeth than Metallica just because of the music to me was so much better. And I don't know if it was because it was more technical. A lot of early Megadeth was politically charged, too.
Yeah,
there was a lot of
sure
politics involved in his lyrics, and anti-war. So when I talked about that on some of the politically and socially conscious lyrics, he obviously came to mind. Dave Mustaine we're talking about. Always been a big fan of Megadeth.
Yeah.
I just, whether you like Dave Mustaine or don't like him, it's kind of always been his thing. So many members have come and gone, but he's kept it alive. He's kept it going. You just seen him last year, and you said they were excellent.
Yeah.
Every time I seen them, they were excellent. So there is a high bar for proficiency, technicality, and just good songwriting. Even some of the new Megadeth is freaking cool as hell to me, dude. I think it's great.
Yeah.
It's just not ever something. There's so much new music that I want to consume. It's just hard for me to kind of go back sometimes to a band and be like, oh, Megadeth's got a new album, I'm going to crank it. Not that it's not good. It's just I really like, I just in exploring new territory, really.
Yeah.
But love Megadeth. Always loved Megadeth. But at least they do hold their way in the big 4 of thrash metal. As popular as Metallica, not even close.
No.
But
there's a huge gap between number 1 and number 2.
Yeah, for sure.
Like it's a wide canyon. I'm sure that eats away at Dave every day of his life. Like, because he could have been in the biggest metal band or the biggest band in the world. That didn't work out for him. But obviously it needed to happen, for Dave's own good. Like he needed to, kind of like, and it took him years to come out of all of the trouble in his life, the personal stuff that he had to go through and with addiction and whatnot. But yeah, to have Megadeth and Metallica in this timeline, makes it worth the visit.
Yeah,
like I love this timeline for Metallica and Megadeth, especially when we're talking the mid '80s stuff to the early '90s stuff. Like I absolutely love it. Had a huge impact on me, all of those albums.
And just on a side note, the funny thing about life is maybe Metallica wouldn't have been as big as if Dave stayed in the band. Maybe there were some decisions made along the way, and Metallica is just another band that fits into the Exodus or Overkill category, where they're just another thrash band. So you don't really know. Like, all those things have to happen to be where you're at now, right?
Yeah, right.
So that's just a path of life. So you could bitch and whine about all you want, but maybe you wouldn't have been riding in that private jet they're flying in now.
Right.
That might not be the case. You know?
Right.
So, and then number 3, I would say this is probably one of the most undeniable bands. And for me, like, to be great, you have to be undeniable. And this is Slayer.
Oh, yeah.
Because I listen to a lot of thrash for this, and I think this might be a good time to insert this comment, is Slayer to me just takes the cake.
Okay.
I mean, you like Slayer, you don't like Slayer, you like his vocals, you don't. Yeah, it all kind of sounds the same in a way, but to me, this is kind of the top tier of thrash. Like, I feel like Metallica and Megadeth are kind of two different entities. They're a little more commercial, whereas Slayer paved the way for all the shit that I like, is all the death metal stuff, all that. So they kind of took something even more extreme, more dark, satanic, like, because Megadeth and Metallica, they're flirting with little skulls and killing them all and this and that and the other thing. Slayer's like, fuck it, upside down crosses,
pentagrams,
bullet arms, you know,
spikes,
nails, spikes, all that shit. So they kind of took it even further, and they were the ones that influenced a lot of black metal, a lot of death metal. So to me, these guys are just undeniable. I'm not saying they're better than Metallica or Megadeth. I'm just saying they kind of sit on their own pedestal to me in a way that they influence a whole lot of different stuff as well. Rain and Blood, but most Slayer is goddamn good, man. I don't care what you say. Like, to me, you know, especially them early albums.
Yeah.
South of Heaven. I mean, some bangers on there. Seasons in the Abyss.
Yep.
I mean, some very, very undeniable greatness with Slayer.
Yeah, they are one of the quintessential thrash metal bands of all time.
And I'm just saying, and maybe I'll bring this back up, but when I'm listening to these Exodus and Death Angel and all this, it's good. It's just not as good as Slayer. It's just, to me, it's just not as good.
Sure,
like,
fair.
You know, it's just Slayer. You got Slayer up here, and then you kind of got all the other thrash bands.
Yeah, songwriting might be a little bit better. Vocals might stand out a little bit more. There's great drum work on them Slayer albums. You know, like Dave Lombardo is not just a great drummer and capable, but he's got nice touch. Yep. You know, like he's all over the kit in ways that make you think, oh, he's not just fast and or powerful, but really good choices, you know, like he really stands out as an excellent musician among all drummers in thrash. So,
and the groove in Slayer is also usually undeniable because they do bring a lot of groove into it. They keep it punk, thrash, hardcore, but they do bring some of that groove in that it's just undeniable.
Yeah, and that groove has a lot of impact too because of how fast most of the rhythm is. That when Slayer breaks it down, it really has like tremendous impact. You know, when you get to like an Angel of Death breakdown or a Rain in Blood breakdown where you're going 90 miles an hour all the time, and then you go halftime and you're like, oh, that hits hard. Like, oh my God, that's the heaviest breakdown ever, you know.
Yep. And then Anthrax. So I know you could speak more to these guys than I can, even though Anthrax is one of my first tapes. I really like these guys. But to me, Anthrax is on their own pillar as well. So you got the big four, and they all have their own characteristics of things that are unique to them. Because the Anthrax, they merged the thrash and the hardcore punk. They got their serious stuff, but then they start adding some humor in their music. Yep. They start adding crossover hip-hop stuff. They start exploring with a lot of different sounds, whereas these Slayer, Megadeth, Metallica, they kind of stayed, you know, you want to talk early thrash, they kind of stayed in this one vein, whereas Anthrax, to me, was more of an exploration of sound after the first few albums. They really started, let's try some things, let's go some different direction, and I've always loved Anthrax as well. Dudes can hang with anybody.
Oh yeah,
you can't say Metallica, Megadeth, and Slayer without saying Anthrax. Like,
right, well, big four.
Yeah, so you know, to me, but they're on their own pillar. So you can speak more about Anthrax if you would like to.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that does set them apart is that sense of humor, like you said, and the style. Like, they were a little bit more colorful in their appearance. You know, they got the jam shorts and, you know,
the hats,
the silly hats, kind of,
the bill and all that. Yeah.
So they don't look as edgy or mean or even as serious necessarily, especially when you get into that State of Euphoria era, which there was a lot of turmoil within the band at that time. You know, it wouldn't seem that way unless you like read Scott Ian's autobiography, or, you know, you're a diehard fan to understand like things are kind of unraveling internally within the band around the State of Euphoria era. You know, they would even say like, man, here we're going on stage wearing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle stuff. It's kind of ridiculous. Like, and I think they would kind of rein that in a lot just from the gap of State of Euphoria to Persistence of Time, where they're like, nope, we're going back to leather jackets. We're going back to looking mean. You know, we're going back to no smiles, and we're going back to like more serious lyrics, which existed on State of Euphoria, but then they kind of doubled down on it when you get to the next album. But yeah, there's a lot more eclectic or diverse musical influences in Anthrax, I would say, and that shows in the output of their music, like with a lot of the hip hop stuff. You get to Attack of the Killer Bees, there's all these cover songs that they did, you know, Kiss, some Discharge I think was on there maybe, but they had some punk and some hardcore stuff on there as well. So yeah, they had their own flavor, and yeah, the sense of humor was definitely big with that band. But it wasn't the only element. I just think it was one of the things that stood out, because I don't think anybody's having a laugh with Dave Mustaine.
Not really.
Guy's way too serious about his work. Like, he has a sense of humor. It's really dry.
Yeah.
You know, like, you have to understand that. And Metallica too, they're just too busy being kings of metal to like sit here and have much of a sense of humor. And I'm sure Slayer's got a bit of a sense of humor, but they're just too busy being evil.
Yeah.
You know, like, everything's just about Satan and hell, and they're not being a god or, you know, anti-Christian sentiment, whereas Anthrax didn't buy into a lot of that stuff at all.
Right.
It doesn't even exist. I think, in fact, there's Catholic members in that band. I think maybe Charlie, for that matter. I'm not 100%, but also with Slayer, you know, Tom's Catholic, you know, but you don't really get that. You just get Satan all day in your face.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the religious thing, not really big, but the political thing, definitely big in Anthrax. But the sense of humor, probably one of the biggest things that stands out, and their love of rap.
So we'll talk about a little bit of subgenres and variations, but before we move on, one more thing about the Big Four. So all these bands have such a long career. I mean, they're all pretty much still doing it. Even Slayer, retired, is still playing shows. They may not ever come out with new music. I would say Slayer took the less time exploring new sounds because of the whole new metal thing. We also did an episode on new metal, so go check that out, because we talked about these Big Four and how they were influenced by that. Yeah. But just to touch base on that, is Metallica really changed when they went into Load. They got Bob Rockified. They just wanted to write good songs, which, you know, there's some good songs on Load, but they were not thrash metal anymore.
Nope.
Megadeth started feeling the new metal burn when they started coming out with Cryptic Writings, which was a good album. Then Risk, don't know, never really listened to it. And then they had a couple dumpers in there, and then they kind of came back around to thrash metal.
Yep.
Slayer, they kind of spent a little time when they downtuned and they went to Diablo, so a lot of people will go to bat for that album. I may have to listen to it again. Not my favorite Slayer. I kind of liked more of the thrash metal Slayer, and even the newer Slayer when they come back around and find their thrash sound again. And then Anthrax has kind of always been all over the place, but they did have the big change when they got John Bush in the band, and they had a more polished, almost clean rock sound at times with some songs, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know how much they were influenced by the new metal burn. Like, they didn't start really doing the Korn riffs or anything, but you know,
a part of the change with all four of these bands is not just new metal, but we have to take into account like the grunge era.
Yeah.
You know, so
and we'll talk about that too.
Yeah. But you know, now you've got Nirvana, Pearl Jam, like dominating the scene in the 90s, right? 90 to 94, basically. That, I think, impacted not just the bands, but like the record labels. They were like, hey, we need something like this.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when Anthrax changes their vocalist over to John Bush and you get Sound of White Noise, a lot of people are going to go to bat as that's the best Anthrax album ever. Well, to me, I'm like, it's great. But again, it's a departure from there's no thrash element to that album.
Right.
But it's dark, it's moody, it's heavy.
Hard rock.
Yeah, and it sounds like a really good Soundgarden album is a comment that I read one time on the internet, and I was like, wow, that really resonated with me because I never thought of it that way. But it is a really great Soundgarden album. It's the heaviest Soundgarden album I've ever heard.
Right.
But it was new for Anthrax. Obviously, you have the new vocalist, but the songwriting shifted, I think, significantly enough. I don't want to say drastically, but it definitely, like, they dropped a lot of beats that they didn't come back to a lot of that thrash. They're like, hey, been there, done that. Yeah. And I got to give it to all of these bands for changing it, having the courage to change it up. It must have been something that they were kind of dreading. Maybe there's a lot of pressure from the labels, like, hey, we need something more accessible. This is what people are buying and listening to now, and we need you guys, if we're going to give you money to tour and print albums and fly you around the world, we need to have something that the people are going to buy. And right now the people are buying Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Right.
They're
That's
buying.
a great point, dude.
I mean, the grunge I think it just kind of comes into play before the new metal, because Korn doesn't hit the scene until 94, but they're really not even popular until 96.
99, yeah.
Well,
really.
96 is when we saw them.
That's when we seen them, and they were just coming on the scene.
And they were like, a couple months away from dropping Life is Peachy.
Right.
Their second album, which we saw them just ahead of that by a mere few months. But so the new metal thing starts to really kick off in about 96 and to the early 2000s. But the bands in question here, like, their style change was drastically affected by, the grunge era, and then they kind of started to fold in with the new metal to stay like heavy. Yep. But for a minute there, it was pretty bleak, and you touched on it, like Load. Like, wow, that's a huge departure from even the Black Album.
Yep.
Megadeth does what? Cryptic Writings? I'm going to go with Cryptic Writings. Yeah. And, like, that's just a rock album. Yeah. Like, it's a good album, but it's a rock album.
It's good. I like it.
But got a couple of metal tracks on that. Fight for Freedom, Vortex. They're pretty good. Slayer, again, Diablos and Musica. We kind of talked about this on the new metal episode.
Still metal, though. Still heavy.
Definitely metal. Not as affected by grunge, and definitely more affected by new metal
with the down tuning and some of the Cold Chamber-esque almost riffs on there.
And I want to say that album came out in about 90. I want to say like 96 or 97. I could be off by a year or two there. But then Anthrax with Sound of White Noise, like, that was about a 1993. I want to say. So they're right in the middle of that.
The Diablos was 1998.
Okay, so late enough to where they had the luxury of time to sit here and say, like, okay, new metal's a thing. We can roll into that a little bit without having to sound like grunge, because I'm sure Kerry King fucking hated grunge, like, with a burning hot passion.
Yeah, for sure.
Whereas Anthrax was able to kind of work in some of that grunge, but also some of the new metal. But I don't hear too much new metal in the Anthrax catalog, even though that's a good place for them to exist, with there being rap such an influence and impact on their personal taste. But they never really sounded new metal to me. No. They just sounded like they rolled into that grunge thing a little bit, but stayed like heavy.
Yeah.
And I appreciate those albums with John Bush, but they got less heavy with each release. Yeah, I still like each of those albums for having, like, several bangers on it, but I can't sit here and say, like, oh, that's some of their best work. Some fans might say that. They got some great songs across the John Bush era, but none of it's thrash metal at this point, is like the main part. All of these bands took a departure from thrash and would later return to it, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah,
for sure. And I'm sure we'll touch on that along the way.
Yep. So with any style of music, then you get into the subgenres. I know you have people on both sides of the fence. I hate subgenres. It's just metal. It's blah 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 blah. And I said this before on the show, and I'll live and die by this. The reason why we start adding some of these subgenres and different labels on this music is we just want to put it in a box so we know where to find it later.
Yeah.
Right. Because
you want to be able to communicate an idea to somebody.
Exactly. And like I said at the beginning of the show, you have something you could call thrash, and then on this side of the fence, and then it could go all the way on this side of the fence, and it would still be thrash, but it's 100% almost different. It has some of the same elements, but it could be completely different from this band. So that's where these subgenres come in. So when we say these things, this thing isn't Bible. This isn't scripture for us. We're just saying some things. So if you want to say what you want to say in the comments, that's fine. I don't care. But so some subgenres and variations. You got some crossover thrash, mixes thrash metal with hardcore punk, which I think most of it is. You got bands like Suicidal Tendencies, DRI, Municipal Waste, Power Trip, faster, more straightforward than traditional thrash. You got technical thrash, more intricate song structures, more complex time signatures. You got influenced by progressive metal and jazz fusion.
Yeah.
Bands like Coroner, Voivod, Watchtower, and Vector. You got blackened thrash, which mixes elements of thrash metal and early black metal, darker, more sinister atmosphere and trem picking. Bands like Sodom, Hell Ripper, and Aurora Noir. You got...
That's a tough band name, Aura Noir.
Yeah, Aura Noir. That's the whole water cooler thing. That we talk. Yeah. You got Teutonic thrash, heavier, rawer, more aggressive than American thrash. It's more of a German thrash. Often features heavier guttural vocals, themes of war and destruction. Bands like Creator, Destruction, Sodom, and Tankard. And then you got groove thrash, like 90s thrash evolution, slower, heavier riffs, influenced by groove metal. Bands like Sepultura in the mid-90s, Machine Head, and Exhorter. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the groove thrash in there. But, then I'll just reiterate. So you got the 90s decline. So we got the decline and resurgence of thrash metal now.
Right.
You got the 90s decline, what you just spoke on, the grunge movement, dominated mainstream rock, a lot of that. And then thrash bands softened their sound like Metallica after the Black Album. They experimented with groove metal and alternative metal. So, we haven't talked about Sepultura yet. We will, but Sepultura is also one of those bands that was all the way. I mean, they put out practically a new metal record.
Yeah.
With new metal dudes on it.
Yep.
So it completely shifted away from what an Arise was, or so a lot of the bands were influenced by that. But at that time, when you are beholden to a label, like you said, that are offering however much money for you to go record, for you to hopefully sell some tickets and sell some albums, we got to have what's selling right now. So that makes complete sense. Whereas nowadays, you don't really have that as much. There isn't. So
No.
There are bigger bands and labels that you have to be beholden to. But since almost everything's a DIY and you can just put your music online, you can play whatever you want to play and people are just going to like what they will like, right?
Yeah. And I think the industry has probably changed so much since that time where it's not even about what your style is anymore. Labels, if they even exist anymore, they'll welcome whatever. Now we just want to see a professional work ethic. You got to show up. You got to be, hey, when your studio time comes, better be ready.
Yeah.
We're not going to sit here and write it in the studio.
Right.
Got to be ready. When it's time to hit the road, better be sober.
Yeah.
We're not sitting here paying for you to be in AA, and take all this time off and be sick and hungover and strung out. got to be professional.
Right.
So the game's changed. Nobody's Led Zeppelin anymore.
Right.
Can't just be doing whatever you want, whenever you want.
Yep.
You can't be Guns N' Roses anymore. Can't just go on stage an hour late, causing a riot in Montreal.
Smashing shit in hotel rooms.
Can't do it.
Yeah.
So now I think the industry's just looking at who can do the work, who can show up in the studio ready, who can go out on the road, and who's got the personality for it. That was a big thing, too. I mean, everybody's a rock star, but who can really have a rock star attitude and be a professional at the same time? Right. So the industry is really looking for people that are going to just show up and clock in. You can be whatever style you want anymore. Now, we don't care what style you are. It doesn't have to be groundbreaking. We've almost heard everything possible.
Yeah.
Everything's blended together. It's almost... It's almost wild to hear a band that's going to be a throwback to one style only. Now everybody's all different styles.
Yep.
So now we're just looking for people to show up and do the work.
And then some more with the early 90s decline, then the death metal and black metal overshadowed thrash's extreme elements. So guys like us, going back to the beginning of the episode that you talked about, when you started hearing that death metal and black metal, you're almost like, well, thrash metal's cool, but it's not death metal and it's not black metal.
Yeah.
I know you're not big into the black metal, but it is if you're looking for the next extreme thing.
Yeah.
You have it to choose from now, right?
Yeah. And that was a huge part of the evolution for me, and the style altogether is just what's heavier than thrash metal?
Right.
I've heard all the thrash metal albums from 83 to 90. I've heard every album by every band almost, and you're like, I need more.
Right.
I need heavier. And then you find out, oh well, there is heavier. You had to find it. It wasn't as easy back then, but we've talked about that a lot.
Yep.
But when you finally do, you're like, there's no going back. I like this death, this deicide, this obituary. I was like, I'm never going back. Unless it's somebody who's never heard these bands is like, hey, man, put on that Metallica album.
Right.
Fair, fine, cool, but have you heard this obituary?
Right.
This is the sickest thing ever. You have to hear this now. I don't like his voice. Yeah. Tough shit.
Right, yeah.
We've arrived. Here we are.
Yep, here we are. And that's us, Some people just got stuck on I'll only listen to Arise Forever from Sepultura, and then after that,
Great
I'm good
album.
on whatever, and more power to you. So, and then you got the 2000s thrash revival, so you're looking, got a new wave of bands, revive the old school thrash sound with a modern touch. Some key bands are Municipal Waste, Havoc, Warbringer, Evil, and Vector.
Sure.
And then veteran bands return to their roots, Metallica, we talked about that.
Yep.
Megadeth comes back.
The
Slayer's pushing more of the thrash metal back, so a lot of the bands kind of started re-engaging with some of the sound that they had to begin with. So, and then we talk a little bit about thrash metal today. So you got the old school bands that are still active, Testament, Exodus, Creator. These guys are still fucking going.
Yeah, Overkill, they're still out there. Yep.
You got new bands keeping the thrash alive, Power Trip and Forest Nervosa.
Okay.
And then you got crossover with other genres, which everything's crossed over now. So I understand the argument of, well, it's a subgenre, because it doesn't really exist.
Right.
Because everything is everything. Black and thrash, death thrash, progressive thrash. You could even take away the thrash, and now it's just death metal, or, so there's just so many elements that are shared. But, so why is thrash metal important? It revolutionized heavy metal and paved the way for death metal, black metal, and groove metal. You had to have some extreme before you had the next extreme, and that's basically what thrash metal to me did.
Yeah.
It influenced so many bands from Pantera to Lamb of God, and it remains energetic, aggressive, and technically demanding, and it's just an all-around great form of metal. So we're going to talk about some more early is there anything else you want to talk about as far as just, the basics of thrash metal?
No, let's keep it rolling.
Cool. So we're going to talk about some other early pioneers, and feel free to jump in. We've already talked about the big four. We already said that: Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax. I guess we're talking about anything from, what would you say, like, when did the Black Album come out?
90?
90?
90, 91.
So 90 going back to the early 80s, we're really living in this thrash-tastic world. Maybe early 90s with some of these bands.
Yeah, even the Black Album itself, we're dropping thrash.
Yeah.
We're still heavy, but we're not really. There's like zero thrash on that album. And Persistence of Time from Anthrax did have thrash to it. If you ask me, I'd say there's some thrash on there. But Countdown to Extinction, not really.
Dirt, maybe.
Maybe Architecture of Aggression feels a little bit that way.
That was kind of more almost like the groovy thrash that we'll talk about here.
So a huge departure from Rust in Peace to Countdown. Again, maybe just feeling the shift in the music industry from 88 to 90. That's 2 years, is a long time. And we've been doing this style for a long time now. That may not seem like it in hindsight, like, 83 to 90 is not that big, but it's massive. It's a huge jump from the beginning of thrash metal to where we end up, just even in 1990, in a 7-year time span. Like, they had done it all, all over the world. So I think that, it was time for those bands to maybe shift their sound. And Metallica was the pioneer in that respect too. They were the pioneers of thrash metal, and then they were pretty much the pioneers of shifting their sound and saying, okay, we've done thrash metal, like, we've done it, and we're kind of tired of doing it, and more power to them. I know when we were young, we talked a lot of shit about Metallica, and even on this show I have too. But to be fair, to be objective, every musician has the right to grow and change their sound, and it's, more power to them, because I couldn't imagine playing the same style of music my whole life. If it works for you and that's what you want to do, great. But personally, I couldn't do it. I would have to say, I'm really tired. I got to set this down. Like, I want to play something else, man.
Yeah.
My heart's not in it anymore.
Right.
And if those guys felt that way, like, I don't want to do Ride the Lightning anymore, man. I don't want to scream like that anymore. Like, those guys are huge into, like, totally different styles of music outside of metal. It's not like we only listen to metal all the time.
Right.
And at some point, if it's your livelihood, you're like, what can I do to change, my livelihood and still have a livelihood, still have a job to go to? And I think they did a good job with that when you get to Load, like, still rock.
Yeah, it's not a bad album.
Still got riffs. Yeah. We're still doing guitar solos.
It's not a terrible album. Load. Anything after that, for a while, I was good on, but I didn't hate Load either. I remember buying it the day it came out. So
yeah, I just think that there were bands now at this point in their career that were doing the thrash metal thing and heavier, and there's heavier music. And at some point, you probably take a look in the mirror and you're like, I'm not going to out heavy that.
Right.
I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
My heart's not in that anymore.
We talk about that just with our own music.
Yeah,
like you can't
just be heavy all the time or be the heaviest thing all the time.
Right.
So like I think it's fair to say that these bands were ready to kind of move on, and the fact that they revisited it, that's fine too. It's kind of like, oh man, remember the 80s when we used to do thrash metal?
Right.
I'm kind of in the mood for that again, 30 years removed from that era. Like I'm ready to kind of go back to writing a Death Magnetic, you know. So, you know, that turnabout is fair play. It's all good.
I also think I want to bring up another point before we move on to some of these bands that we're going to list of some of these genres of thrash.
Sure.
I almost want to say, you know, it's hard to put the ego aside too. So you're influenced by the labels saying, hey, this music is really kind of in the spotlight now, right?
Yeah.
This music is what's going to sell. This music's what's going to pack the venue. Well, you don't want to be riding high and packing out all these venues, and then you play a show now with this same style of music, and now you're relegated to some small club, and only half the people show up.
Yeah.
And you've been selling out arenas or stadiums or LC Walk arenas or whatever, you know, at least venues like that. That's kind of a hit to the ego, too, because you're like, I've experienced all this, so maybe I do have to change if I want to keep my own ego in check and keep all, you know, you can't say that's not part of it either, where it's almost a half and half. Yeah, we're influenced by the people that are running the show, but we're also influenced on, I still want to be the man.
Well,
you know,
ego is definitely a part of it, but so is the wallet. Like, here's the thing that, you know, the average person has to understand. We all get up, go to work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. But these guys are not going to that life. They're not putting the guitars down to pick up the power tools and go to the shop or become businessmen and sell houses. They're just not built like that. They're not wired for that anymore. They already have a whole livelihood built on touring the world, selling albums, performing in front of an audience.
Yep.
Like that's not just something they do for fun. This ain't your garage band. This ain't your hobby. You know, this ain't hanging out with the boys. This is, I need to get paid.
Right.
And so at some point, if your boss comes to you and says, we're doing things different, you kind of look at your boss and you might say, well, that sucks. Like, change hurts. I didn't want to change.
Right.
But you also have to be real at some point and say, what else am I going to do?
Right.
Your hands are kind of tied. Just like, if you want to make money and, you know, like, you don't want to go down to being like a club act because you already did that on your come up, and now you want to sustain, like, hey, you want to keep the same salary? Well, here's what you got to do to earn it now, you know? So that's got to be a huge part of it. And I know that we throw the term sellout around loosely.
Right.
We overuse that term, but there's a couple of other factors at play, and one of them is money. And it's not, you're not selling out for the money. You're selling out for keeping your fucking job.
Yeah.
You know, like I just want to have my job.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, as we just mentioned, your style changes. You know, like this, what you want to do changes, your tastes change. So you couple those things together, like, yeah, we've done the thrash metal thing, and if we keep doing it, we're going down to a smaller venue. Or we can just say, all right, we need more accessible music, which means, you know, XYZ things need to change.
Yep.
And then I can sustain my living. Because at this point, you know, if you're talking mortgages, like, hey, I can afford to have a house, and then your boss tells you, well, now you're going down to minimum wage, you know, and then unless you get on board with the new program.
The changes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So then you start looking at your finances and you're like, well, how heavy can we keep it? How heavy do I even want to be anymore?
Right.
So yeah, I think that that's a huge factor in, you know, these bands kind of changing their sound. And some bands didn't. You know, some bands kind of stayed at the level they were at, and they made it, you know, on the back of their diehard fan base, like an Overkill. Like they just,
or Testament.
Yeah, they just stayed in that vein. But yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that the bands that were that big and doing the arena tours, you know, their sound changed for good reasons. And I know it's, at the time, you're like, why can't they be as heavy as the death metal bands? You know, why didn't they get heavier? Why did they get lighter? And it's like, well, the death metal bands aren't, like,
they ain't making no money, dude.
They're not. No, they're going to work. They're literally, they have jobs, you know, and they get out on the road and they tour, you know, and then they go back to their jobs.
Yeah, it's like a side hustle. It's not a hobby. It's a side hustle, you know.
So I think that, you know, that's the biggest difference is when it's your livelihood, you're a little bit more flexible when it comes to to being able to make the bills paid,
And some of that too might be almost beneficial. You change your sound. Maybe someone comes in on a load and they're like, "Oh, I kind of like this rock. I thought Metallica was just screaming into the mic and this, that, and the other thing." And then they might listen to some of the Evolution, and then they might go back and be a Metallica fan of some of the other stuff. So it's not always a terrible thing that you change your style, because you might be able to be an influential band to a lot of other fans that might dig your other stuff too. It might grow on them.
Yeah. Oh no, I feel like I witnessed it in real time as the Load album dropped in high school. Now we have students, our peers who were not into the metal like we were. Then they discover Metallica with Load, and they're like, I like the new Metallica album. Now they're fans. Now they're listening to the back catalog. Hey man, I just listened to Master of Puppets for the first time. I see what you guys are on about. Like, even though I'm not into Death and Carcass, like, I am into this Metallica, and I appreciate that more now. Like, whereas I didn't really know, but I was listening to Anthrax when I was in 5th grade. Like, I had the I'm the Man cassette, and I had State of Euphoria on cassette. So I was, there was no hope for me.
Yeah, you were already down the road.
Yeah, I was deep into metal at that point. But yeah, you do grow your fan base when you start introducing some diversity and changing your sound, even if it means softening it. Just face it, like, they're more accessible.
And you can alienate people as well, but you can't make everybody happy all the time. We know that. And there's no point of even trying to do that, because you're just going to put yourself into a lot of pain, and you're going to be wishy-washy, and you're not going to stay true to your values because you're trying to be a people pleaser, and you're trying to make everybody happy. We know this podcast isn't for everybody. It's just for metal dudes, like
musicians. Metal dudes.
Yeah, I mean, musicians. If if we wanted to have a podcast about, I don't know, self-help or true crime or something, we might go after what's popular or what's happening, So,
but switching it back to like the thrash metal topic here, I know that those bands did change, but we did have some bands that kind of stayed true, and I think that's kind of where we're at here right now.
So we got some early thrash pioneers as well. You got Exodus, which I give Exodus a lot of props. I just could never get into dude's vocals so much.
Yeah.
They were just like really. I just always remind me of like that little mogwai that got wet after midnight. Like, that's what his vocals sound like to me. Like, not even gremlin in a good black metal way, like gremlin in a like annoying, you're destroying my house kind of way. Yeah. You got Overkill, which I've always been a huge fan of. These guys always crush, but they've always stayed at that level too of just like, we play these smaller clubs, and I think they've always kind of been on that trajectory, but they're still putting out music. And Bobby is a hell of a vocalist. I know you said something earlier about some of these guys aren't the greatest vocals. Some of these guys are pretty damn good vocalists too. Which
Bobby's great.
Yeah,
he's amazing, and he's been able to keep that voice for decades.
Yeah.
Like, that's incredible to me. Overkill, one of those bands that never really strayed. They didn't need to experiment, and they're like, I don't wanna, I'm not gonna. Like, they didn't rise to the like arena filling capacity. Like, they weren't that big, but they had true staying power with their diehard audience, so they were able to kind of keep things the way that they wanted and liked and were used to, and they're still relevant, I think. They still tour, they're still doing the thing, still putting out albums. So yeah, another great thrash metal band that stayed thrash throughout it all.
And you got Testament. You cannot talk about thrash without talking about Testament. These guys are players. I love Chuck Billy's vocals, because he almost sometimes gets into more of that death metal register at times. Mm-hmm. Even when he didn't try to do that, he had that real gruffness to his vocals. And Testament's one of those bands that I should probably listen to a lot more of, and I never really have.
They got a lot of work.
But a lot of the stuff I've listened to, I just really like it. And I feel like they could have been part of the big five almost, but they just never really ascended to that level. Then you got Creator. Creator, to me, was, these guys they were thrash, they were fast as hell.
Yes.
This is where one of those bands that almost starts tipping into like the death they're kind of on the coattails of death, where they didn't get into the death metal, but they were real damn close with how fast and aggressive they were.
And the vocals too.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
More of a gruff sound. I do like some Creator. Destruction, This is one of the bands that I've heard of but didn't listen to until I started preparing for this episode. Super cool band. Very heavy but very thrash. Sodom, to me, these guys, you could almost say they're death metal.
Okay.
Because of their vocals. There's the real harsh vocals.
Nice.
But they're just faster than everybody else. To me, they're extreme thrash metal. They're on that precipice of, you could call them thrash, but you can call them death metal as well. Celtic Frost, we've talked about them in the black metal episode. They were a huge influence on black metal.
Yep.
Sepultura, obviously, I mean, they put out some of the best thrash. Period in the beginning. I just love most all those first early episodes. We don't have to dive into them deep because we have
a whole.
Yep, we got 2 episodes dedicated to just Sepultura. So if you want to learn everything about Sepultura that we put the work into, go listen to those episodes. And we went through the catalog and rated as well the albums. So we have a lot of Sepultura material.
3 Sepultura shows.
Yep. Dark Angel. To me, just kind of a cool band. We know Gene was in this band at periods of time. And I think he actually started in this band, didn't he? Gene Hoglan, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe it was.
Or no, that was Death Angel. I'm sorry. Not Dark Angel. I guess I'm not real familiar with Dark Angel.
I've listened to some Dark Angel, and they are just as much a thrash metal band as some of these other bands on here. They just never got to a level of fame that most people know them as a household name.
Yeah, I was thinking Death Angel, so that's Gene's band. Voivod. To me, these guys were just kind of a heavy Motorhead. I don't really get the Voivod thing. They are kind of thrash, but they're just more on that happy side to me a little bit. I don't know.
The Voivod thing is weird. They're all over the place. You really have to take this band with an album by album case. Yeah. Because they're just going to be progressive on one. They might be thrash early on, like you've got some of their older stuff listed here, but they're another one of those bands who decided, like, we're not going to stay thrash. We're going to do whatever we want. And so they get off into some really weird progressive tangents in some of their work, but early stuff probably more just straightforward thrash.
You got Nuclear Assault. You got Razor, they're just kind of that motorcycle riding, hell raising, like thrash metal. I wasn't a big fan. And Exciter, they kind of were along the same veins of that. Then you got some expansion of thrash. So this is where we start getting into thrash elements. So you got like Sacred Reich, where they had a lot of the power metal and thrash together. Violence, another one. They're very punk driven.
Hardcore
thrash.
punk.
Forbidden. Flotsam and Jetsam, where they kind of went all over the place. I don't know, some of their later work wasn't as thrashy either. Right. They kind of evolved around the bend, obviously.
And then they came back around to it.
Yep. And we know those guys because Newstead from them joined Metallica. Death Angel, now this is where I was talking about. Death Angel, great thrash band. Yes. I really like Death Angel.
Yes.
Super cool technical riffs.
And I believe
very cool vocals.
Their vocalist is Kerry King's current vocalist.
Okay, yeah. So
that guy is amazing. I do wish personally that he were able to juggle Death Angel and the Kerry King thing a little bit better. I think there's been some conflict there where Death Angel's kind of had to go on the back burner because he's got the Kerry King gig. And again, we just spoke to this like not 5 minutes ago. Like sometimes you got to look at paying the bills. Yeah. Unfortunately for his mates in Death Angel, that means like they're going to have to find some side gig or something because now Mark's doing the Kerry King thing and he's going to make a lot more money.
Yeah.
And he is a really great vocalist. And if he gets to go out there in front of a Kerry King audience, which is basically a Slayer audience, and he does sound a lot like Tom Araya, dare I say better. Like if Slayer
he's got more of a range to me than
and if Slayer
Tom
had
does.
Mark in the band from day one, like Slayer would have been even more massive. Like no disrespect to Tom. Tom's got a cool voice. I like it. Yeah. But like Mark, he can hit really high notes and he's still able to do that. Kerry, just as a tangent here, but Kerry heard Mark's work on record for his new album and he said, he was a little hesitant. He said, "This sounds really good, but I got to know this isn't just a studio thing. I got to know that you can do it live." And then he said, they'd rehearse and he can do it day in and day out. And Kerry was like, "You're in." Like, that's it. Like, that's what I'm looking for. So, Mark's still like a top tier vocalist, criminally underrated. I am happy for him being able to get out there and get the bag and stay in front of some larger audiences. So, Death Angel, great band with Mark, especially on the vocals.
Quick little tangent too. We didn't talk about this on episode on the albums of last year, but I do remember listening to it and I forgot to mention it. And I didn't hate the album, but I'm not like married to Kerry King or Slayer. And some people are so diehard Slayer fans they don't want to hear Kerry King doing anything unless it's Slayer.
Right.
And then you got Kerry King and his attitude too, which can be kind of off-putting to some people as well. But to me, it's neither here nor there. I thought it was okay. I didn't hate it or anything.
Yeah.
People just wanted to hate it because it wasn't Slayer, So we get in that. And then you got Whiplash, you got Coroner, Heathen, Holy Moses, and Toxic Holocaust, because those guys are more of the resurgence of thrash. They're more of the 2013. They had some real raw recordings in the beginning, more of a retro thrash influence. But okay. I can mess with some Toxic Holocaust. And then you got some. You start adding this grunge and groove metal and alternative rock in the 90s. So we're going to talk a little bit about some bands that were influenced by thrash. Pantera. They got thrash elements. They have a lot of elements. They're you talk about like fucking Hostile. You talk about
punk hardcore.
Yeah,
which
Pantera
speaks to thrash.
had their most groove metal, but they did have some thrash elements. And some tuk-tukas in there. Machine Head, thrash elements, but they're more groove thrash. Grip Inc., another Dave Lombardo project.
Yeah.
Post Slayer, so they kind of fit in with that, but they kind of fit in with all of this. Nevermore, a lot of thrash elements in Nevermore. They're more of the progressive metal, though, very technical.
Yeah.
Sometimes, if it wasn't for Warrell Dane's, like, more power metal vocals, they would even verge on death metal on some riffs and some songs, really.
Yeah.
But they're kind of all over the place with the melodicism. Nevermore, I'd like to talk more and do more and say more about Nevermore because they're so damn good.
And interestingly enough, poised for a comeback. There's been, Jeff's bringing the band back with Van. They're recruiting for a bassist and a vocalist. I think they've already got their second guitarist. It's not named yet, but I had been working on like putting together a piece about Nevermore prior to this news, and now it seems like an even more important thing for me to like finish, get into the Nevermore bit. Well, specifically Warrell Dane was going to be the topic, but I could veer it into more Nevermore altogether. But Nevermore on the comeback, so looking forward to that.
Love Nevermore. Annihilator, another band that I checked out in order to do this episode.
Yeah.
Fucking love these guys.
Really?
Dude, it was
awesome.
Great, man. They were just like cool time changes, cool riffs. The singer was cool. He had like 3 or 4 different like thrash vocals. He kind of had like the harsh thing. He kind of did a little bit more of the power metal thing. He did a little bit more of just like the clean, soothing type singing, I guess you could say.
Sure.
And I was just like, damn, I need to jam these guys a little bit more. I was pretty impressed.
Nice.
Then you got Demolition Hammer, Depressive Age, a couple of bands I'm not really familiar with. Sadist, of course, Steve DiGiorgio. A Vision of Misery was the
album.
We learned about Steve through Death.
Yep.
Then we're like, oh, Steve's in something else. Picked up this tape. I remember having The Vision of Misery and just absolutely loved it because it was just so technical, so fast, so cool. Even their new stuff is great.
Even in another band that is right there on the precipice of being a death metal band.
Yeah.
They're right up there next to like a Creator where they're just in that. They're so heavy and fast in terms of a thrash metal band. They're like, they check all the boxes for thrash metal, but then they're heavier and they're meaner than some other thrash metal where it might be a little bit happy or just average.
Right.
But these guys' musicianship and speed and having Steve in the band just gives it a whole other element. I honestly believe that Steve is not a member of the band anymore.
Really?
Yeah, I was really surprised. It was just kind of a quiet fact that I learned. I was like, oh, but I didn't know they ever announced it or that he quit. But he's either not on the newest album or he just doesn't tour with them anymore. But
he does a lot though too. I mean, he was on the Megadeth record, one of them. He was, he does a lot of stuff with Testament. So he's working,
So a real quick point I want to make to musicians listening: when you are of the caliber of musicianship like a Steve DiGiorgio, don't tie yourself down to one band.
Right.
If you know, you don't got to say it, but if you know in your heart of hearts that you're a better musician than 9 out of 10 guys playing your instrument, you should make yourself available to several bands. You want to go out there and be a musician, a professional musician, a touring musician, a studio musician, and that's all you want to do. You don't want to do content creation even. I only want to play the bass. Steve's got like 20 bands or more in his pocket. He's playing for the Death tribute band. Yep. He's played for Sadist. He's played for Megadeth. He's just played for so many bands. I can't list them all.
Yeah.
But you want to be able to have the diversity in your musicianship to go out there and play for a bunch of different bands on a whim.
Yeah.
Like you want to be on the short list. Like who can we call that can learn this stuff in 2 days?
Yeah.
You want to be that. If you know that you're that caliber of musician, make yourself available. Don't tie yourself down to 3 other dudes who may or may not, be the ones, Like, if you're that good, go out there and put yourself out there and do other gigs too, and just don't stay tied down to one band. If you're really good, man, I'd say go for it. Please just take a page out of Steve's book and know that you can do 20 bands and still make it.
All right, so then we got some thrash
revival.
Thrash revival. So, and this may be, if you're a newer listener of metal or kind of got into it in the 2000s, these are some of the bands that you would be more exposed to, like a Municipal Waste, or a Havoc, or a Evil, Warbringer, Gamma Bomb, Bonded by Blood, Toxic Holocaust, and Vector. A lot of that is thrash metal revival, and there's a lot of punk rock involved in those bands as well, or like hardcore. Modern thrash evolution. So this is where we're getting into some more of the crossovers. So you got Power Trip, Dust Bowl, Ultraviolence, Iron Reagan, Lost Society, and Suicidal Angels. So we're still thrashing here in the 2010s.
Yep.
And then
I think Power Trip's on a comeback.
Yep.
Not a fact, but definitely rumored.
And then you got some thrash today. So you got Hell Ripper, Enforced, Plague Years, Nervosa, Cryptosis, Void Blast, War Curse, and Space Chaser. So those are all bands that you could check out that are now 2020s thrash metal. Nervosa, they kind of
precursor to
Crypta.
Thank you, God. Yeah. Another band I would dare to throw in there as a band I've been digging on lately, but I'm a little hesitant to go all in, is Spirit World.
Oh, okay.
And I love the singles that I've heard from this band, but their new album just dropped like this week. So I sat down and listened to like the first 5 songs, and the first riff just kind of hit me funny in a bad way because it was like country. And then I noticed the album art is like, like this Texas cowboy lasso thing. And I'm like, the fuck am I listening to? And I double checked to make sure I was listening to the right band and the right album. And I was, because it had the single that's on the air right now. And it's a great thrash metal song. And they're a pretty good thrash metal band. But what I didn't know is that, this is part of their shtick, is they have this niche country thrash metal thing going on. And I just can't fuck with country. I need to have a very select style of country that's a folk storyteller type of songwriting, where I can't do the mud kicking, like twang.
Yeah, upbeat. But chicken picking.
It almost kind of works with thrash because of the speed and it kind of works. But I'm just like, it's too niche for me to like go all in. But I'll tell you what, Spirit World, not on the list, but the thrash metal songs that they do have, choice, like really, really choice. They had me. I was like, oh my God, this is good. I'm gonna dig into this band. And then you sit down and you listen to the album, and I'm like, I only want half of this. Yeah. This could have been an EP.
That was the band that you shared with me the other day?
Yeah, I think it was one of the bands that I sent to you.
So now that you say that, I remember listening to the Garza podcast episode, and the guy from Spirit World was on there, and now it's all clicking because I remember him talking about that, and I went and checked it out.
Right.
And he was all about like the country aesthetic of everything.
Sure.
Old West, I guess you would say.
Sure.
Right?
I mean, I don't mean to hate, because I've gone out and I've seen, who's the big country guy? I just went to a country concert last year.
Morgan Wallen?
No, Tennessee Whiskey. Who's the guy?
Chris Stapleton?
Yeah, so he's country, right? Are we saying he's a certain type of country?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Then we're getting into country subgenres.
Yeah. Everybody just stop listening. I apologize. Point is like I don't need it infused into my metal. Yeah. That's too much of a reach for me. Like it's just too wild. But great band otherwise. Like if you just put them, like their choice cuts, into a mix, you'll be happy.
Yeah. Unless you do, 26 seconds like BT Bam just to say, hey, look at us do this fucking wild shit. That's about the only place that it really...
Yeah.
There's a lot of country I actually do like. I never used to like it, but I actually like it a lot more. But I'm more of I really like the sappy, singy, songwriting shit. Yeah. That's the stuff that I'm just crying because of my fucking grandpa. I miss him and shit because that's the kind of shit that I like.
Fair.
Stuff that rivets me,
Yeah. I don't do the truck driving, mud splashing.
Yeah, I hate all the upbeat country, and I'm just kind of always like that. So I'm not a big fan of punk. I just don't like the upbeat stuff, like the happy shit. I just, because even it could be dark, and you could still do that upbeat thing, and it's just, I don't know.
Yeah, it loses me.
Yeah, it doesn't really resonate with me. But
I need the groove.
Yeah. But, there could have been a few bands, maybe 25, that I forgot. But I just, like I said, if this is the beginner's guide to thrash metal, I think, like you said, this episode was long overdue. I think thrash metal is so important when it comes to metal.
Yeah.
And now, everything is everything. Everything's hardcore thrash, death metal, deathcore, blah, blah, blah. Everything's everything now. But, I mean, it's been around for 4 decades. It's evolved. It's come back. It's seen a resurgence, but it's always been aggressive. It's always been, for the most part, melodic, and you've always had great players on thrash, because you do have to be a certain caliber player to play this fast, whether it's the drums, the super tight right hand on tremming, the chords. You got to be a great player, and so
you got to put the practice in to be in to be in a band like this, and it's nice to see there's a resurgence of it. Just the thing is like even a resurgence isn't going to have a very huge fan base, because again, metal in general has expanded so much to where when this stuff first came about, it was the thing to listen to. It was the most extreme. Now it's not the most extreme. Now we're kind of hemming ourselves into, we don't want to be death metal, but we want to be heavier than Iron Maiden.
Right.
We want to be more aggressive than that. So now we're kind of hemming ourselves in a little bit. But I'll tell you what, some of the bands that I have heard that are out there doing this right now, they're good. Like you got Go Ahead and Die, Max and his Sons.
Oh yeah.
Creeping Death. Like, hey, where have I heard that before, right?
Yep.
So there's a band. There's a lot of it that's good. If you are a fan of the Big Four, here's another band, Schizophrenia.
Okay.
Like there's a lot of new thrash metal out there now, so it's still relevant. I just think that we're kind of limiting ourselves. But that's a choice. Like that's definitely a choice to be made. Like if you want to play only thrash metal these days, it's a good time to do it. I mean, we had He Who Dwells on here as a great example of like a kind of a metalcore band that's got a lot of thrash in there too. So if you like thrash metal and that's about as heavy as you want to go, there's a local act right there that I think would be right up most people's alley, because they got like metalcore but a lot of thrash.
And then another one, Convulsus, that band,
yes.
the hot dog video
yes,
or whatever.
Yep.
Those guys,
Kings.
Awesome, dude.
Yeah.
Those guys are awesome, and they're from the other side of the state, but they're great, and they keep it thrash.
Yeah,
like they
100.
fit in with this 2020s thrash metal today.
100%.
They were great.
100%.
And I'm sure there's a lot of other bands out there like that. But
yeah.
We give you a good springboard on this show to hopefully get you into some of these other bands, or at least talk about some of these other genres that maybe you can expand your knowledge with. So
yeah, and I think anybody that's listened this far into the conversation, if we missed any bands, just drop them in the comments section.
Tell us your favorite thrash bands and why in the comments.
Yeah. I think
any we missed that you want us to check out.
Yeah, I just think that I had noticed more and more thrash metal kind of cropping up through the Liquid XM and just crossing my path in the algorithm on YouTube or whatever, and I was like, I guess thrash is kind of making a comeback. The new metal's kind of making a comeback. Now the thrash is making a comeback, and it's cool because we were there like the first time around, right as it was falling off, and then we get into death metal, and now it's coming back, as is the new metal when we were there the first time, and it's only, God, I guess it's 20 years since maybe new metal started to fall off, and it's where did the time go? But it's back in ways. But both of these genres are coming back. It'd be interesting to see if we have like a new metal thrash metal hybrid because they kind of started to blend a little bit in the late 90s, early 2000s, and now we're a whole 2 decades removed from when that was all a thing in the first place. Be interesting to hear if we have a new thrash sound develop over the next year or two.
Yeah, and we'll see. Everything's always evolving. So, yeah, anything more about thrash? I think we covered a good beginner's guide to thrash metal right there, bud.
No, I love it.
Good conversation.
It was long overdue. It's definitely something that is huge, kicking off the extreme metal genre. Like I don't think you get death metal in 1985 without Slayer. Like if you don't have Hell Awaits like blowing people's mind, and they had albums prior to that,
right? But
Hell Awaits to me was like, oh, this is basically a death metal album. Tom just needed to hit more gutturals or more fry vocal, but with all the vocal effects on it, like you had death metal, but it was kind of like almost like here today, gone today type of thing. You really needed the Chuck Schuldiner to step forward and kind of carry that flag. You know, there was Possessed also for like the album or two that they put out in the first place, but Chuck kind of picked it up and ran with it. Your Cannibal Corpse moving from Buffalo to Tampa to fit in. Glenn Benton with Deicide. These guys are like, no, we're gonna do way heavier than thrash. We're gonna be monsters. Trey, Morbid Angel. I just don't think like you really get the popularity you want out of those bands unless you have the big four in thrash to kind of pave the way. They were heavy. They were fast. They were grooving. They were
more technical.
Yeah, musicians, they really focused on their playing. It wasn't as much about attitude, and that's something we spoke about with Jeremy and Luke when we talk about hardcore. There's more that attitude, and then with metal, it's just kind of like I'm staring at my fretboard. I don't want to fuck up. I've been practicing in my room for hours. I want to make sure that I get this across to the audience without, thrashing about, being all crazy. So musicians start to really pick up their craft and run with it, But yeah, good conversation, good talk. Let us know in the comments if we missed anything. And
keep it metal.
That's what's up.
Peace. Thank you so much for checking out the episode. Be sure to hit that like button and give us a share.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed our podcast today, please give it a rating on your streaming service to help us gain some exposure.
And if you really enjoyed the show, please give us a follow or hit that subscribe button and come hang out with us every week. And remember, keep it metal.